Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. Yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord. And my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. From these verses today, I want us to look at the theme, the Lord who saves us. And we are going to be looking at about 3 questions as we look at these verses and at this theme, the Lord who saves us. We are going to look at the fact that what does God save us from? We also want to look at how he actually saves us. And finally, we'll look at why he saves us. In these verses, we see that it's a continuation from what we saw in chapter 1, that after Jonah had decided to run away from God, we see that God sends a storm on the sea that he was moving on, and the sailors get him out of the ship and throw him into the sea. We see that the verse ends in chapter 1. The last verse says that God appointed, or the Lord appointed, a big fish that actually swallowed him. And so in these verses here, it begins by telling us that in chapter 2, that Jonah is praying to the Lord, his God, from the belly of the fish. And in these verses, we see that first of all, what does God save us from? That God saves us from our distresses, from our afflictions. You see, in verse 2, he says that I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. We see that Jonah here is saying that what he was actually going through is distress. Other versions would call it affliction. That he calls it his distress, my distress, because first of all, it is a distress that he was going through himself, so it is his distress, but also it is his distress because it is a distress or affliction that he brought to himself. By deciding to rebel or run away from God, God actually brings this affliction to him because he was running away from him. And we see that in the verses he continues to explain the kind of affliction that he was going through. He says that it was the fact that he was in the belly, he was out of the belly of Sheol. He cried because he was in the belly of Sheol. When he says in the belly of Sheol, some versions will call it in the belly of the grave, or that he was in the grave. Not to say that he was actually in the grave, but the word Sheol is something that the Hebrews used to refer to a place where the dead go to. So because where he was, there was death looming, that he was actually going to die, he says that he was in the belly of Sheol. He says that he was cast into the deep, into the heart of the seas, or the center, or where the seas begins from. In the deep, he says that he was surrounded by floods, waves and billows passed over him. He says that he was driven away from the sight of God. You continue on in verse 5, it says that the waters closed in over him, that it were about 10 deep surrounded him. By the time he talks about the weeds wrapping around his head and going to the deep and going to the places or the roots of the mountains, it suggests that possibly it is now before he's actually swallowed by the belly, that when swallowed by the huge fish, that when he's thrown into the sea, he goes deep into the sea. And this is the distress that he's going through. But God in his power actually sends a big fish that swallows him. Because as he prays, he's praying in the belly of the fish. We see the kind of distress that Jonah is going through, a kind of affliction that he's going through that no one could save him. He says that death was close to him, that this was about to take up his life, but actually God brought him out of the pit. So whereas this distress or affliction is one that he brought himself, we still see the same thing spoken in the Psalms. When you read in Psalms 118, we see that the psalmist also prays the same way we see Jonah pray. In Psalms 118, Verse 5, he says, out of my distress I called on the Lord. The Lord answered me and set me free. And when he talks about the distress he was going through, it looks like for him the distress he was going through was the distress of the enemies that surrounded him. He says in verse 10, all nations surrounded me. We go to Psalm 120 and we still see the same thing repeated. He says in verse 1 of Psalm 120, in my distress I called to the Lord and he answered me. Deliver me, O Lord, from lying lips, from a deceitful tongue. So we see that the psalmist in Psalm 120, in Psalm 118, that they are all going through affliction, but actually God saves them from the affliction that they go through. It is possible that the afflictions we go through are afflictions that we have brought directly to ourselves because we are rebelling against God. Sometimes the afflictions that we go through are afflictions that come because we live in a fallen world, that sin surrounds us, sinners or enemies or people who don't fear God actually fight us, that then we go through afflictions. It is possible that the afflictions we also go through are afflictions that God has sent because he wants to display his glory. For example, the blind man in John chapter 9, or even the story of Job, it is God who allows this affliction to come to him. That in all afflictions, whether it is because you have rebelled, whether it is because we live in a fallen world, whether it is because God has brought it to display his glory, we can call to him and he promises to save us from affliction. And I believe that the deepest or the greatest affliction that we have faced is the affliction that comes because of sin, because it says that the wages of sin is death. But see, he promises to give us salvation from even that greatest affliction. The second question would be, then how does he actually save us? After seeing what he saves us, how does God save us? We see in the verses where we were in Jonah that what Jonah does was to cry unto the Lord. He says that he cries unto the Lord, he prays unto the Lord, because he says, I called out to the Lord and he answered me. In verse 2 still, it says, I cried and you heard my voice. You continue on in verse 7, it says, when my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord and my prayer came to you. We see that Jonah, for him to receive the salvation of God, he cried to the Lord, he prayed to the Lord, he remembered the Lord or turned back to the Lord. But you see, even when he says that he calls, he cries, he remembers, still it is actually God who leads this to happen. Because in verse 3 he says, for you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas. Well, as he's saying that God is the one who cast him into the deep, into the heart of the seas, we know in chapter 1 that it is the sailors who throw him off board. But even when the sailors are the ones who threw him off board, he still recognizes that it was God working this out. And so as he's running away from God, God brings these situations to remind him, to cause him to remember the Lord. That even in when he calls for God's salvation, it is God who begins it. And I believe that even for our salvation, it is God who begins it. Because we are dead in our sins, as Ephesians chapter 2 verse 1 says, that we are blinded by the God of this age, 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 4, that we cannot understand spiritual things, 1 Corinthians 2:14, that we are enemies of God, Romans 5:10. So if we are all this, we can't actually save ourselves. It takes God who regenerates us, who opens our minds, our eyes to see the light of the gospel. That even if you could say that you could choose him, if God never provided Jesus, then who would you actually believe? So we see that he saves us from our distress, our afflictions, the greatest affliction being sin. That how does he save us? He saves us by grace. It's him who begins it. It's him who works in us to be able to actually believe him. And why does he save us? When I looked at this question, why he saves us, I remember my wife telling me about somebody that he was caring for. And this person asks her, why do you actually love me? And you see, for us, when we are cared for, when somebody cares for us, we start thinking that probably they expect something from us. But that is not for God. That he actually saves us because that is who he is, that he is a good God. When you go to Psalm 118, before the psalmist says in verse 5 that I called upon the Lord and he saved me, or called upon the Lord in my distress, we see that in the first verses, he actually describes God as steadfast in love, as good. Let me read that for you. In verse 1 of Psalms 118, he says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever." And then he says in verse 5, "Out of my distress, I called on the Lord." So before he says he calls on the Lord, he describes for us this Lord that he calls, that is a good Lord. That because he is perfect, he is good, it is him alone who could save us. Everyone else needs God to save them. So why does he save us? Because he's the only one who is good. But also he saves us because he's steadfast in love. That his love does not depend on what you have done or what you haven't done. That he saves us out of his steadfast love. No wonder Jonah says in this prayer of his, in verse 8, that those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. Because as a prophet who was prophesying in the northern kingdom, where people were worshipping idols, who had deserted God, he says that they had forsook their hope of steadfast love. Because you see, this God who saves us is steadfast in love. You see, in John chapter 3, verse 16, it says that for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. We see that what leads him to bring his Son who saves us is actually love. That he's good, he therefore can save us. That he is steadfast in love, he therefore saves us. But also, lastly, you see what Jonah says in his prayer. He says, salvation belongs to the Lord. Some versions will say salvation belongs to Yahweh. When we read the name Yahweh, the personal name of God, we are referring to his aseity. The fact that he is self-dependent or self-existent. He does not need anything to be God. So to say that he does not need us, he does not need us, but he chooses to save us in his grace, in his goodness, and in his love. No wonder we see verse 10 ends, the Lord spoke to the fish. Because why? We see that after Jonah coming to this realization that he's in affliction, and the only one who could save him is the Lord Almighty, the God who is not dependent on anything. He realizes that salvation belongs to the Lord. He starts desiring to go back to the temple, which is a picture that actually he had repented and turned to God. Verse 10 shows us that God asks or speaks to the fish to vomit him, which finalizes the way he actually rescues him from the deep where he was. My brother, my sister, we serve a God who saves us. In this fallen and broken world, broken by sin, heartbreak, addictions, sin that has held us, I'm here to remind you that the Lord saves us from all those afflictions, that he saves us by grace, and he saves us out of his goodness and his steadfast love. God bless you.
We would like to invite you to enjoy